Alright, in the previous section we described how we can communicate across domains using the window.postMessage function. I mentioned that there's a library that makes this easier for us called PostRobot, and that is the topic of this section. So, PostRobot. PostRobot is a PayPal-developed JavaScript library to aid in post-message communication. By transforming senders and listeners into JavaScript callback format, it dramatically reduces code and complexity. PostRobot is open sourced on GitHub and can be used by anyone. And now we're going to go over the documentation. So if you went to github.com, Kraken PostRobot, you'll see the actual PostRobot library. And in it has the documentation. So you can see just an overview of the functionality that's included with PostRobot. And then you have the detailed how to use the library. So for this training, we're going to focus on simple listeners, simple senders, and then function messaging. So you can see here, in order to set up a listener, we would call postrobot.on. We send it a name of the message that we're actually going to listen for, and then that returns the event when it's actually called. And then in order for it to communicate back to the calling window or the parent window, we just return in the callback function. So we return this object. So now this object is actually post message back to the parent window. So here is a sender example from the documentation. You can see you call postrobot.send, and that's equivalent to the post message function call from the previous exercise. You can see that you call it on some window, you give it a name, and then you send it the actual message. So in PostRobot, we can actually send it an actual JavaScript object without stringifying it like we had to in the previous exercise. So that's definitely one feature enhancement here in the PostRobot library. And the second being that in 2 sets of statements, I can do the full sender and receiver send and receive and confirmation messages, because when I actually return in the listener, it comes back into the then portion of the send. So here we're saying var user equal event.data. So now user is actually this object right here. And then we can actually call the user.logout function. So that's odd that we can actually call this user.logout inside of the other parent window, because logout is actually a function that exists on another domain in another iframe. So how that works, if we go down to the documentation for functions, you see that PostRobot lets you send across functions in your data payload. So here's the example of it. So we're doing logout, current user logout. So this is actually returned when somebody calls the GetUser message. So here we're sending the GetUser message, and then we're receiving the response, and then we're actually calling the logout function, which is right here, and executing current logout on the actual page, the child page that was rendered in the iframe. So, and that's definitely one of the most important functionality pieces of the PostRobot library. And how it actually works is the function current user.logout actually exists here on the child page. And then when the parent page calls it, it actually just sends a message to this page saying, hey, I want you to execute that logout function, and then this page actually executes it, and then responds back via post message the result of executing that function. So that's why anytime you execute these functions, it'll always return a promise, since it's always asynchronous. So you'll always see the then portion when you execute a post message function. All right. So some of the key benefits of using PostRobot that we just went over: one function sends a message and listens for a response. Queuing, there's no need to wait for the iframe to load like we did in the post message exercise. We can message objects without stringifying, and we can message functions. All right, so once again, let's just take a quick look at how we can implement messaging to get a current user and what that would look like on the sender and receiver. So on the sender, so you could think of this as our parent page in our current example. We want to say if a user is currently logged in, we want to send a message called GetUser. So we're going to send it. This should be the actually iframe window, and we're sending a GetUser message. And in this example, we're sending give me the user ID 1337. So that actually gets sent, and the PostRobot receiver on the child page iframe actually is set up to listen for the GetUser. And once it hears it, it returns this object, which is a user object. And then when that is returned, it actually goes into the then portion of the promise. And we can console.log event.data.name is cool dude, which we'll see here, which is the what we returned. And then the event.data.logout is a function, which is this function here. So PostRobot Setup. So unlike a post message setup that requires 4 working parts, PostRobot reduces that to 2. We have the PostRobot.send that sends the message, sets up the listener for the response, and then we have the PostRobot.on on the iframe that listens for a message and returns a message in the callback. So the PostRobot event is a little different from the post message event structure. It looks like the following. You'll see that the data is actually already an object, so we don't actually have to stringify or parse it. The rest of it is actually unique to the PostRobot library. It's close to the event that comes back on the post message, but not exact. And here is a diagram going over the flow of a PostRobot setup. So on your sender, actually on the child first, once it loads, we would call PostRobot.on, which you would be listening for a specific named message. And here we call PostRobot.send on the parent or the sender. And that immediately returns a promise, so the rest of our application will keep on loading. Meanwhile, in the iframe, we receive the message, we're going to update the DOM, and then we're going to return in the callback, which then goes back to the returned promise and gives it the value that we returned. Then the promise is resolved, and we are free to do whatever we want in our application. So that is it for the PostRobot lecture. The next video will be going over our exercise on PostRobot.